Good morning, class. I hope everyone is doing well today. My name is Charles Griffin, and I'm a graduate student studying managerial science at Amerton University. I'm here today to talk to everyone about servant leadership. This presentation was made for Dr. Sanchez's HRT6570 class for the summer 2016 session. Servant leadership has become a topic of increased discussion since the 1970s, and one that brings about a little bit of controversy with it. As you can see here, we have the table of contents. During this presentation, we will first look at the introduction. During the introduction, I hope to introduce the topic, define the term, discuss the purpose of this research, highlight why the research is relevant, and discuss the assumptions that I made going into the project. Following the introduction, I will list the 12 authors that made up the bulk of my research and discuss a few of the contributions that these authors made to the research and practice of servant leadership. The next part, the analysis, will take up the bulk of the presentation. This section will look at what the 12 researchers discussed earlier regarding servant leadership. I will compare the pros and cons as discussed by the authors and give some examples as to why previous researchers felt the way that they did. After talking about this, I will focus on what being a servant leader means and how it affects those around them. The part of servant leadership that is rarely discussed is how it affects the leader both positively and negatively. I will discuss this and follow it up with the limitations of my research. There are several important aspects here that future researchers will need to pay attention to in order to gain a better understanding of servant leadership and its practices. Following this, my method of research will be laid out so that everyone will know and understand my thought process and be able to apply this to furthering their research. Slide 10 will again look at my limitations and offer solutions that may create for better research, should someone want to study the same topic. I will end by restating a few of the key points of discussion and references used in the research. The topic of this presentation again is servant leadership. The term alone can stir up mixed emotions. Servant leadership is rarely attempted at being defined. However, it is generally seen as a practice where leaders put the needs of others before themselves, share power, and try their hardest to develop those around them. Servant leadership requires much of the leader, which can cause both positive and negative effects for the followers as well as the leader. The purpose of my research was to analyze these effects in order to determine whether or not servant leadership is a viable leadership practice. The study of servant leadership, as with any leadership style, is very important. This is because the lives of employees and the lives of their families can be affected by both good and bad leadership. As the slide states, leadership is a vast and complex task that has the ability to affect lives and organizations. It is a difficult task that has the ability to end careers and companies if done poorly. My assumption going into the research was that there was enough existing research to fully understand the topic and make an educated analysis regarding servant leadership. This was generally the case. However, there was not much research to be found on how servant leadership affects the leader's personal lives. Listed here are the 12 authors that shape my analysis of servant leadership. My goal is to gather information from these authors and from them form my own thoughts and opinions of servant leadership. Robert Greenleaf first used the phrase servant leadership in the 70s and said the following quote, "The servant leader is servant first. It begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead." Most research done on servant leadership is very positive. Some of these pros are listed below. The first, respect from employees, stem from a leader who is not constantly barking orders. Employees respect someone who treats them fairly and is willing to share in the struggle. As mentioned earlier, servant leaders strive to develop those around them. As a result, the organization, with a servant leader in charge, generally has outstanding subordinate leaders who care deeply for the organization. Another positive that can be attributed to servant leadership is employees' needs being met. A servant leader is very humble and takes the time to get to know employees. Servant leaders go out of their way to ensure employees never go without and ensure that their opinions and concerns are heard without reprisal. When employees are treated this way, there's a side effect of what some call a buy-in. When employees buy in, they care deeply about the organization and believe in the values of the organization. This causes harder work and better productivity. Though most of the research was positive, some previous researchers saw some downsides to this approach. Some authors noted that employees can see a servant leader as weak and walk over that leader. There are very few examples given, however, the concern is still there. Another concern was that humble servant leaders don't get noticed. As a result, some research suggested that servant leaders get promoted at a lower rate because they aren't making sure that everyone sees them doing well. Although this was the case, servant leaders were deemed more successful over time. The next two negatives go hand in hand. The first says that servant leadership is not easy. It is difficult to try to care for every individual in an organization, and as a result, servant leaders can wear themselves out if overdone. Servant leaders have to constantly be aware to make time for themselves and their families if they are to remain positive and uplifting to their employees. The last con is that servant leadership takes time. Servant leadership is all about making relationships, and relationships take time. If the goal of a leader is to make long-lasting change within 30 days, servant leadership may not be the method to take. It is not human nature to trust someone on day one. Relationships take time, but they are a necessity for servant leadership to work. This slide will be focused on the characteristics of a servant leader and how these leaders affect their followers. These are very self-explanatory, and the characteristics that it takes for a servant leader to be successful are compassion, time, maturity, rationality, humility, effective communication skills, and ethical behavior. Some authors list more, however, these are the ones that show up most often throughout. One thing of note is that a servant leader must have all of these. If they lack in one area, such as ethical behavior, employees could lose all trust in that leader, which may slow down the productivity, communication, and teamwork. The lists on the right are common themes that employees report as benefiting from a servant leader. As you can see, they are all positive and all stem from absolute trust and faith that the leader has their best interest in mind. If employees feel this way, they will go above and beyond to put in their best work in order to make the leader happy. Another question that this research aimed at answering was how servant leadership affects the leader. To be unbiased, I attempted to list both positives and negatives. The three big positives that I saw were leaders finding joy in employees' development. It allows the leader to grow themselves through understanding what employees go through, and it encourages positive relationships. These are all great things, but the negatives should not be ignored. Servant leaders sometimes turn into workaholics, which can strain themselves mentally, as well as strain the family members. Servant leaders want to put in their best effort for others, but sometimes do not take care of themselves. Another downside is that employees may try to take advantage of servant leaders. This may come in the form of questioning authority or blatant disrespect. Servant leaders need to be strong enough to recognize this and take measures to prevent or correct these wrongdoings. The last negative, that is a negative of all leadership, is that servant leadership can be lonely. As mentioned, most servant leaders work late nights, which can make someone lonely. This feeling can cause people to drop this method because of the difficulties that come with it. There were several limitations to my research that should be addressed. The first and major limitation was the lack of research on how servant leadership affects the leader rather than the follower. Almost every article or book first defines servant leadership and how it betters the organization and the employees. I believe more first-hand studies should be done on the personal lives of servant leaders. Another limitation, that is the fourth bullet, is in agreeing who is a servant leader. Because of the many definitions, not everyone agrees on who constitutes a servant leader. When people disagree on this, it makes researching the topic very difficult. This leads us into the last limitation, the definition itself. Some call the term servant leadership an oxymoron. The term is hard to figure out because it reshapes the way we think about leadership. We traditionally think about it as using our given authority in a manner to influence others to accomplish a desired outcome. The term servant leadership involves influencing people through relationships, which may not be the most popular way to think about leadership. My methodology was very simple. I looked at existing research to see what was out there regarding servant leadership. I tried to create an original concept from this research that would help explain the positives and negatives of using this approach. I aimed at seeing how the style impacted the organization, the employees, and the leader. I then wanted to make recommendations for future research. The suggestions listed derive directly from the limitations. The first suggestion is that future researchers should conduct original research instead of relying on outside sources. They should also look closely at one or two individuals who are servant leaders and see how they live both at work and at home. It is also worth looking at servant leaders and seeing if they exhibit any other leadership styles. My assumption is that it will be difficult to find a leader who only exhibits one style. The last suggestion that I have is to see if various demographics play a role in the effectiveness of servant leaders. I would hypothesize that servant leaders are more respected and trusted as they age. As a recap, here are the major takeaways. Servant leadership is about serving, not being a servant. There are multiple pros and cons in this style that must be taken into consideration. Lack of research makes it difficult to get a holistic view of servant leadership. Servant leadership takes time, and leaders must be patient to earn the trust of their followers. Again, here are the authors used in my research and analysis. They are some of the most well-respected and widely published authors on the topic of servant leadership and leadership in general. Please take a moment to note these authors. Thank you for your time, and I hope everyone has a great day.